What if Fallout's The Institute was based upon a real building? The Salk Institute's concrete halls and hidden symbolism tells a story that mirrors Bethesda's themes of progress, power, and isolation. Let's break down how real architecture can deepen the lore and storytelling behind one of Bethesda's most mysterious factions.
Architectural Outcast.
Randy here from the Architectural Outcast. Recently I made a video criticizing some of the architecture in Fallout 4. And the most common comment I got on that video by far was, Randy, Fallout doesn't take place in the 1950s. It takes place in the future of an alternate reality. The architecture in that world would have its own symbolism, its own history. Therefore, it's unfair to compare that architecture to the architecture that inspired it from our world. I keep saying, no, that's not the way it works. The very reason why you would want to use real architecture in your world building is precisely because of that architecture's history and symbolism. The architecture's history and symbolism does the heavy lifting in the world building. It tells the audience important information about that world and the people who use that specific architecture without the world builders having to explicitly state it. What do they say? Show, not tell. So I'm going to illustrate how a real world work of architecture, the Salk Institute, would not only fit into the Fallout universe, it would enhance the story that Bethesda is trying to tell. Bethesda uses Fallout. Well, they use all their games for this, but we're talking specifically Fallout. Bethesda uses Fallout as a means to engage in social commentary. Bethesda uses the 1950s inspired aesthetic, architecture, industrial design, interior design, fashion, whatnot, to critique American culture, specifically 1950s suburban American culture. Bethesda uses the most common criticism of the post-war suburbs, that the wholesome, traditional, family-focused Americana was nothing more than a facade that hid the dark underbelly of imposed conformity, tyranny, and oppression. The problem I've always had with this particular criticism is whenever you say, oh man, that sounds bad. Who do we blame for all this oppression and tyranny? The answers get vague. The American people, American culture, the government. But whenever you start asking questions about specific institutions, say like academia, suddenly the criticisms become watered down and so wishy-washy, they make Charlie Brown look steely-eyed and determined.
Randy, you do realize that in Fallout, there's a faction called the Institute? They're the descendants of professors from MIT. They're evil. They don't exactly make academia look good.
Thank you, spooky voice. You know exactly where I'm going. It's almost like you can read my mind. As I said, watered down and wishy-washy criticism. The criticism is vague and generalized, and it's not really even a criticism of academia in of itself. The Institute is more a warning on the dangers of science. Outside of being a famous university in the general area, near DC for Fallout 3, and of course in Boston for Fallout 4, we're never given a reason why it was chosen to represent the dangers of science. Within the story, we're never told what was the problem, the fundamental flaw with MIT before the bombs fell that caused the Institute to become evil. Again, outside of dangers of science and some vague power corrupts. In fact, the evil head of the Institute, the main protagonist of Fallout 4, Sean, spoilers, isn't from the Institute. He's an outsider. Don't you see? It's not really the Institute's fault, all the evil stuff they did. They were just following orders. The Institute's architecture, while there's nothing wrong with it in of itself, is just as watered down and wishy-washy. It's just generic 1950s inspired science place where scientists do sciencey stuff. The architecture has very little symbolic meaning. It tells us nothing about the Institute and MIT. And yes, I know, in the game it's called CIT. Simply put, Bethesda pulled their punches. Oh, they had no problem going hard in the paint against consumerism, McCarthyism, and all the other isms that are usually leveled at the post-war suburbs. But when it came to criticizing institutions like academia, watered down and wishy-washy. Science is dangerous and power corrupts. Next topic. What's ironic is if Bethesda had been willing to go as hard into the paint against academia as they did the post-war suburbs, there is a real-life institution that it's believable would have been the ancestors of the Institute. And what's more, their architecture would tell that story. Now, before you all start yelling, it wouldn't work. The Salk Institute is located out in California. Yeah, and Fallout is an alternate reality. You tell that story. Jonas Salk, or Fallout's equivalent, decided to set up his institute outside of Boston instead of California. 9 times out of 10, whenever I show somebody an image of the Salk Institute for the first time, I will hear, "Whoa, that's ugly." And yeah, I'm with you. I don't like the way the Salk Institute looks either. There's a reason why it's called Brutalism. But there's more to aesthetics than just its visual appeal. Aesthetics are directly tied to meaning and symbolism. The Salk Institute is named after Dr. Jonas Salk. You know, the guy that invented the polio vaccine. And because of that vaccine, he became incredibly wealthy and very influential. Instead of spending his millions on mega mansions, exotic cars, and cavorting with supermodels, Dr. Salk wanted to create a lasting legacy, and to that end, he envisioned a research institute. To achieve this dream, Dr. Salk hired Louis Kahn, one of the preeminent architects of his day. The reason why Dr. Salk hired Kahn is because they had a shared vision. In addition to being an architect, Kahn was a teacher, and he believed in a holistic approach to architecture. Kahn had become famous for the conversations he would have in front of his students with writers, philosophers, painters, sculptors, scientists, and even politicians. Both Salk and Kahn envisioned a research institute based upon an older medieval model, at a time before the division which has led to isolation between the arts and sciences. The Salk's architecture was inspired by the institution that had kept knowledge alive throughout the Middle Ages, the monastery, more specifically, the cloister found within a monastery. Salk and Kahn's vision was to bring the arts, sciences, philosophy, and even theology into a shared space of quiet contemplation, where they could influence each other, which would lead to a new renaissance in human thinking. When Dr. Salk came out with the idea that he wanted to create a new type of research institute, blending science and humanities and art and metaphysics, the scientific community said, "Love it, let's do it." Unfortunately, Dr. Salk made a major mistake. He hired the science faculty first. Once the architecture was done, and most importantly, once Dr. Salk had set up all the funding, because the scientific community was dang sure not paying for all this, but once it was all up and running, the scientists shut the doors after themselves. They refused to allow the Institute to hire anybody who wasn't from the sciences. And once Dr. Salk passed away, they just marked out the multidisciplinary part of their mission statement. It gets worse, way worse, and from my perspective, there's an even bigger betrayal. Part of Dr. Salk and Louis Kahn's vision of a multidisciplinary approach to research, they wanted the public to be coming in and interacting with the faculty. They believed that the public would be a key component in this free exchange of ideas that would lead to a renaissance in human thinking. If the scientific faculty of the Salk didn't think they had anything to learn from authors and philosophers and theologians, and painters and sculptors, you can imagine what they thought of the unwashed masses. Let me give you all a free piece of advice. Don't be showing up to the Salk uninvited. At a bare minimum, call ahead and make a reservation, because otherwise you won't like the reception you get. It turns out that the Salk is one of the most secure places in the United States. Why is that, you might ask? Well, it is a premier scientific institution doing world-class cutting-edge research, pushing the boundaries of science. You gotta guard those secrets. But the main reason why security is so tight, a lot of that cutting-edge world-class research that's pushing the bounds of science is morally and ethically dubious. They can't have some random Joe Public wandering in, catching them doing morally and ethically dubious research. They might want to put a stop to it. Wouldn't want that now, would we? If this is how the Salk's faculty is willing to act out in the open and in front of everybody, y'all can imagine what they would become like if they were ever isolated and left to their own devices for a couple hundred years. Fallout Institute is believable. If anything, Bethesda sugarcoated it.
Randy, this is all fine and good, but most people don't know this history about the Salk. So then, why would the Salk's architecture still be a good fit for the Institute?
That's a fair question. But remember, my thesis is that aesthetics are directly tied to history and symbolism. And it's true that a lot of people don't know all the details of what goes on at the Salk. But the Institute has an ominous, shady reputation. A lot of the Salk's ominous and shady reputation comes directly from its architecture. More specifically, its aesthetics. Salk and Kahn screwed up. They made a number of major mistakes. Now, in their defense, one of the mistakes isn't really their fault. You can't expect people to predict the future. If you look at Kahn's body of work, you will quickly recognize he had a distinct aesthetic. He was one of the early innovators of an architectural style now known as Brutalism. The priority for the design of the Salk was human interaction with each other and human interaction with the building. There was also an emphasis on the honest use of materials. The aesthetics were just a byproduct of those two explorations. Now, in the Salk's defense, and I say this as somebody who's been to the building, the experience of the place is very different than you would expect just going by the pictures. The most important thing, though, in the early 60s when the Salk first opened, its architecture was unique and different. People didn't have preconceived ideas about the aesthetics. They were willing to give the architecture the benefit of the doubt. They were willing to suspend judgment until they experienced the building for themselves. For every master, though, there are 1,000 hacks who copy what they see without understanding the thought processes that went into what they're copying. Developers were quick to latch onto Brutalism because they recognized it as a method for cheap and efficient construction. Who cares if what they're building is disposable and soulless? Then there were those who adopted Brutalism as a means to dominate, control, and oppress. Now it's to the point that for the average person, Brutalism symbolizes aggressive hostility and contempt. Hostility and contempt aimed at them. People are no longer willing to give buildings like the Salk the benefit of the doubt. As I said, all that's not necessarily Kahn and Salk's fault. But what is their fault is they baked into the DNA of the architecture a fatal flaw that I argue guaranteed that some of their goals would fail, and it comes out of one of their design inspirations, the cloister. I've experienced quite a few cloisters over the years, and they are wonderful spaces, conducive to quiet contemplation. But how they achieve that quiet contemplation is by turning their back on and isolating themselves from the world. I mean, it's the whole point of a monastery after all. The Salk's architecture turns its back on the world. It's more than a monastery, it's a fortress. It's a citadel on a hill. Even the original entrance is hard to find. It's hidden. The architecture is telling the world outsiders aren't welcome. If you have an architecture that communicates hostility to outsiders, it guarantees you aren't going to have members of the general public knocking on your front door asking to come in. Which means the general public won't be part of this new multidisciplinary approach to creating new knowledge, which also means Kahn and Salk's lofty goals were doomed to failure before the first foundation was poured. I would argue that the architecture is also partially to blame for how the science faculty acted. They entered into this citadel-like space that turns its back on the world, and then they claimed it for themselves and defended it against all comers. Jonas Salk and Louis Kahn's dream of creating a new type of interdisciplinary research where the public, art, and science work together was doomed to fail from the beginning because they chose the wrong design. Imagine that you're exploring the wasteland outside of Boston and you come across a citadel up on a hill overlooking the ocean. And once you make your way inside, you discover a place of quiet contemplation where the people inside, the scientists, are going about their daily lives doing research as if the bombs had never fallen. As you explore and discover more about this place, you learn it was founded by an idealist who wanted to create a research institute that would work for the betterment of all mankind. But things started to go wrong from the beginning. The faculty were already isolating themselves from the outside world because they thought they were just a little bit better than everyone else. And by the time the bombs fell, they had already started doing morally and ethically dubious research. And some of them were even working for the military-industrial complex. They're able to survive the aftermath of the war, radiation and such, because of the advanced technology they'd already developed. At this point, they completely had abandoned their original goal, betterment of mankind, and become completely self-serving. They isolate themselves and then head down the path that leads to the institute that we encounter. You would have an architecture unique to the institute that tells you important information about their history and who they are today without having to talk to anyone. And their behaviors would make sense within the context of the architecture they inhabit. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.